August 1946. Dust rose from the hooves of 100 horses across the high plains of eastern Montana. The sound of leather creaking, spurs jingling, and men calling out in English filled the air where silence had ruled for centuries. Among them, standing uncertain in borrowed denim and canvas boots too large for their feet, were 63 Japanese women who had never seen land so vast it swallowed the horizon. They had arrived 3 weeks earlier on a military transport train, still wearing the gray cotton uniforms issued to them in the detention camps of California. They expected punishment. They expected confinement. They expected the Americans to treat them as their own government had taught them Americans would treat the defeated, with cruelty, humiliation, and contempt. Instead, they found themselves standing before horses and cowboys who spoke slowly, gestured patiently, and handed them rope halters as if welcoming them into something sacred. This was not imprisonment. This was transformation. The program began as an experiment born from desperation and opportunity, colliding in the chaos of post-war reconstruction. In the summer of 1946, the United States government faced an unusual crisis. Thousands of Japanese civilians, mostly women who had been classified as voluntary detainees during the war's final years, remained in internment facilities across the American West. Many had worked in agriculture or domestic service before the war. Many had family members who had fought against American forces. All were considered politically suspect, culturally incompatible, and difficult to repatriate to a Japan that lay in ruins. At the same time, ranchers across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas faced their own emergency. The war had drained the countryside of young men. Entire generations had gone to Europe and the Pacific. Those who returned came back changed, unwilling to endure the isolation and hardship of ranch life. Cattle operations that had sustained communities for decades stood on the edge of collapse. Horses went unbroken. Fences fell into disrepair. The great ranches that had defined the American West faced extinction. Someone in the War Relocation Authority, buried in bureaucracy and drowning in paperwork, saw an opportunity. A memo circulated in July 1946 proposing a labor exchange program. Japanese women detainees would be offered voluntary placement on working ranches in exchange for housing, meals, and modest wages. They would learn skills. They would earn their keep. They would perhaps learn what America truly meant. The memo reached the desk of Colonel Samuel Thornton, a cavalry officer who had spent the previous 4 years training soldiers in Texas. Thornton had grown up on a ranch outside Billings. He understood horses. He understood the code of the West. He also understood something about human nature that most military administrators did not. That dignity restored could accomplish what force never would. He approved the program with one addition. These women would not simply work. They would ride. The first group arrived at the Broken Arrow Ranch on August 3, 1946. They stepped off the truck in silence, eyes wide, bodies rigid with fear. Most had never seen a horse except in photographs. None had ridden. The vastness of Montana terrified them in ways the war had not. In Japan, land was measured in small increments, every square meter cultivated and claimed. Here, the earth rolled away into infinity. The sky pressed down with a weight that felt personal. Foreman Jack Hollis stood waiting with his crew of 8 cowboys, men ranging from their 50s to their 70s. Too old for the war, but young enough to remember how to teach. Hollis had fought in the First World War. He had seen trenches filled with boys from both sides dying for reasons no one could explain. When Colonel Thornton called and explained the program, Hollis agreed with one condition: no guards, no guns, no fences. If these women were going to learn to ride like Americans, they would be treated like Americans. The Japanese women stood in a line, uncertain where to look, how to stand, what to expect. Some had been teachers before the war. Some had been students. One had been a nurse. Another had worked in her family's restaurant in Los Angeles. All had spent years behind barbed wire, their lives reduced to waiting, watching, wondering if they would ever know freedom again. Hollis stepped forward, removed his hat, and spoke in a voice rough as saddle leather. "My name is Jack Hollis. This is my ranch. You're here to work, and you're here to learn. We don't have time for anything else. If you want to leave, say so now. If you stay, you do exactly what we tell you, when we tell you. Understood?" One woman, older than the others, stepped forward. Her name was Keiko Matsumoto. She had been a schoolteacher in Sacramento. She spoke English clearly, though her voice trembled. "We understand. We will work hard. We will not cause trouble." Hollis studied her for a moment, then nodded. "That's fine, but I need you to understand something else. Out here, hard work ain't enough. You need to trust us, and we need to trust you." "That's how this works," Keiko translated for the others. The women shifted, glancing at each other, communicating in the silent language of shared fear and shared hope. Then together they bowed. Hollis frowned. "Don't do that. Not to me, not to anyone here. You're not servants. You're ranch hands now." The first days were disaster wrapped in determination. The women could barely lift saddles. They struggled with bridles, confused by the metal bits and leather straps. The horses sensed their fear and responded with nervous energy, dancing sideways, tossing their heads, refusing commands. One woman, attempting to mount for the first time, grabbed the saddle horn and pulled herself halfway up before the horse bolted, dragging her 10 feet through the dirt before the cowboys caught the reins. But they did not quit. Every morning at 5, they assembled in the corral. Every morning, Hollis and his crew demonstrated the basics again and again. How to approach a horse from the left. How to speak softly, establishing calm before asking for cooperation. How to hold the reins with confidence but not aggression. The cowboys worked with patience that surprised even themselves. These men had spent their lives breaking horses and breaking land. Gentleness did not come naturally. But something about these women, their determination mixed with terror, their willingness to fall and rise and fall again, awakened something forgotten. By the third week, progress emerged. The women learned to saddle their own horses. They learned to mount without assistance. They learned the rhythm of walking, the shift in balance required for trotting. Some discovered natural talent. Others struggled with every step but refused to surrender. Keiko Matsumoto became the unofficial leader, translating not just words, but the philosophy behind them. She began to understand that riding was not about control, but partnership. Not about dominance, but communication. One afternoon in late August, Hollis led the group to the north pasture where 50 head of cattle grazed near a stream. The women had been riding for 3 weeks, but had not yet worked. Hollis reined in his horse and turned to face them. "Today, you learn why we ride. Those cattle need to be moved to the South Range before winter. We're going to do it together. Stay calm. Follow my lead. Your horse knows more than you do. Trust it." The women exchanged nervous glances. Then Keiko spoke. "We are ready." The drive began slowly. The cowboys positioned themselves around the herd, calling out in voices that carried across the grass. The women followed, uncertain but committed. At first, the cattle ignored them. Then one woman, a young girl named Sachiko, who had rarely spoken since arriving, let out a sharp cry, surprising herself as much as the cattle. The animals moved. The herd began to shift, flowing like water toward the open gate a half-mile distant. For 2 hours, they worked. The women learned to anticipate the herd's movement, to position themselves where pressure was needed, to sit their saddles through sudden turns and quick sprints. When one cow broke from the group, Sachiko gave chase without thinking, her horse responding to her urgency, cutting the animal off and driving it back into the fold. When the last cow passed through the gate, Hollis rode up beside Sachiko. "Good work." She looked at him, tears streaking the dust on her face, and smiled. That night, sitting around the bunkhouse stove, the women talked quietly in Japanese. Keiko listened, then translated for Hollis, who had come to check on them. They want to know why you teach us this. They want to know why you are kind when our countries were enemies. Hollis considered the question. Outside, the Montana sky spread black and deep, stars burning with ancient light. Because the war's over, because holding on to hate takes more energy than I've got, and because every person deserves a chance to prove who they are, not who someone told them they had to be. Keiko repeated this in Japanese. The women nodded slowly, absorbing words they had never expected to hear. As autumn arrived, the transformation deepened. The women no longer walked with eyes downcast. They moved with the rolling gait of riders, their bodies adapting to hours in the saddle. They learned to rope calves for medical treatment. They learned to mend fences, shoe horses, and read weather patterns in the clouds gathering over distant mountains. They learned the vocabulary of the West, mesa and coulee, arroyo and butte. They learned songs the cowboys sang while working, melodies without words that spoke of loneliness and endurance, and the strange beauty of empty land. But more than skills, they learned something that had been stolen from them during the war years. They learned to see themselves as individuals again, not as categories or threats or problems to be managed. When Sachiko roped her first calf cleanly, stopping the animal with perfect timing, she turned to the others and laughed, a sound so pure and unexpected that even the hardened cowboys grinned. When Keiko successfully broke a young mare to saddle, riding the animal's initial resistance into eventual trust, she wept not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition of her own capability. The symbolic object that came to represent this transformation was simple: a pair of leather work gloves. Each woman received a pair on her first day at the ranch. Most had never worn gloves before. In Japanese culture, hands were meant to be bare, sensitive, capable of delicate work. These American gloves were thick, rough, designed for gripping rope and reins, for protecting hands that worked rather than served. At first, the women hated them. The gloves felt clumsy and foreign. But as weeks passed, as their hands blistered and healed and toughened, they began to understand. The gloves were not just protection. They were permission. Permission to work with strength rather than submit with fragility. Permission to grip the world rather than simply endure it. One evening in October, as the first snow dusted the high peaks, Hollis gathered the women in the main barn. He had received word from the War Relocation Authority. The program was being evaluated. Officials would arrive in 2 weeks to determine whether it should continue or be terminated. The women needed to demonstrate competence in a formal evaluation. Keiko translated the news. The room fell silent. Then one woman spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Keiko translated. She asks what happens if we fail. Hollis met her eyes. Then you go back. Back to the camps. Back to waiting for someone else to decide your future. Another long silence. Then Sachiko stood. In halting English, she said, "We will not fail." The 2 weeks became a crucible. The women practiced every skill they had learned. They rode from dawn until darkness, pushing themselves and their horses to the edge of exhaustion. They worked through rain that turned the corral to mud and wind that cut through their canvas jackets. The cowboys watched with quiet pride, offering corrections but rarely needing to. These women had found something within themselves, some reservoir of determination forged in years of displacement and uncertainty. On the day of evaluation, 3 officers from the War Relocation Authority arrived in a military sedan. They stood at the corral fence in their pressed uniforms, clipboards in hand, faces professionally neutral. Hollis had organized a demonstration, moving cattle from one pasture to another, roping and treating a sick calf, and demonstrating basic riding skills across varied terrain. The women performed flawlessly. They moved as a unit, communicating in English and Japanese, their bodies confident in the saddle. When the sick calf needed roping, Sachiko volunteered, cantering her horse into position, swinging the lasso twice before releasing it in a perfect arc that settled around the calf's neck. When the herd needed moving, The women positioned themselves with the precision of experienced hands, applying pressure exactly where needed, their voices carrying across the grass with authority. But the moment that defined the demonstration came unplanned. As the herd moved toward the gate, one cow panicked and broke away, running directly toward the fence where the officers stood. Without hesitation, Keiko spurred her horse forward, cutting between the cow and the fence, turning the animal back toward safety. Her horse responded instantly, muscles bunching and releasing, hooves throwing dirt. Keiko sat the saddle with perfect balance, her hands light on the reins, her body moving with the horse rather than against it. The cow rejoined the herd. Keiko circled back to her position, breathing hard, eyes bright. She did not smile or acknowledge the officers. She simply continued working. That evening, the senior officer met with Hollis in his office. The man was perhaps 50, gray at the temples, eyes that had seen too much bureaucracy and not enough humanity. He sat in silence for a long moment, then spoke. "I came here expecting a failure. I came here expecting to shut this program down and send those women back to California." Hollis waited. "But what I saw today?" The officer paused, searching for words. "What I saw today was Americans. Not Japanese, not detainees. Americans. They rode like they belonged here. Like they earned it." Hollis nodded slowly. "That's because they did. The program was approved for expansion." By December 1946, over 200 Japanese women were working on ranches across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. By the spring of 1947, the number had grown to nearly 500. The women learned not just to ride, but to train horses, manage cattle operations, and run entire ranch divisions. Some eventually bought their own land. Some married local men and raised children who grew up speaking English and Japanese, who knew both tea ceremonies and rodeos, who understood that identity was not singular but layered, but the impact extended far beyond individual lives. For the cowboys who taught them, these women challenged assumptions they had carried their entire lives. Men who had viewed Japanese people as enemies discovered individuals. Men who had believed women incapable of ranch work learned otherwise. The West, built on myths of rugged individualism and masculine conquest, found itself transformed by the presence of women who approached horses and land with different values: patience over aggression, partnership over dominance, community over isolation. For the Japanese women themselves, the experience rewrote their understanding of America and themselves. They had been taught that America was violent, materialistic, spiritually empty. They discovered instead a culture that valued practical competence, that judged individuals by their actions rather than their ancestry, that offered second chances and demanded only honest effort in return. The vastness of Montana, which had terrified them initially, became a kind of freedom they had never imagined. Space to breathe, to move, to become. The leather gloves they received on that first day became talismans. Years later, women who had long since left the ranches kept those gloves in drawers, displayed on shelves, buried in boxes of memories. The gloves represented a moment when everything changed, when the world stopped telling them who they were and allowed them to discover it themselves. In the spring of 1948, Keiko Matsumoto was offered a position as foreman at a ranch near Sheridan, Wyoming. She was the first woman, American or otherwise, to hold such a position in the state. She accepted on one condition: that she could bring Sachiko as her assistant. The ranch owner, a man who had lost both sons in the Pacific, agreed without hesitation. On the day Keiko left the Broken Arrow Ranch, Hollis walked her to the truck that would carry her belongings. They stood in awkward silence, two people separated by language and culture and history, but connected by something deeper. Mutual respect earned through shared work and shared struggle. "You taught me more than riding," Keiko said finally. Hollis shook his head. "I just showed you the horse." "You did the rest," she smiled, climbed into the truck, and drove away into a future that had seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The program continued until 1952, when the last Japanese women were officially released from federal oversight and granted full citizenship rights. By then, the ranches of Montana had been transformed not just by their labor, but by their presence. Japanese women had proven themselves capable of work that American men had claimed as their exclusive domain. They had challenged stereotypes about race, gender, and belonging. They had demonstrated that identity was not fixed, but fluid, not inherited but earned. But perhaps most importantly, they had revealed something about America itself. That beneath the myths and the rhetoric, beneath the nationalism and the xenophobia, there existed a different promise. The promise was simple but profound, that anyone, regardless of origin or history, could claim belonging through contribution. That the land did not care about your ancestry, only your willingness to work it. That freedom was not a gift bestowed by government, but a reality created through daily acts of courage and competence. The horses they learned to ride became symbols of this promise. Horses do not recognize nationality or race. They respond only to the quality of communication, the authenticity of relationship, the consistency of care. To ride a horse well requires setting aside ego and control, requires listening before commanding, requires trust that cannot be faked or forced. The Japanese women learned this lesson in corrals and pastures, in long days under endless sky, in moments of fear, transformed into moments of triumph. And in learning it, they discovered something the camps had tried to destroy: their own agency, their own worth, their own power to shape their destiny. Years later, historians would debate the program's significance. Some viewed it as exploitation, another form of forced labor disguised as opportunity. Others saw it as genuine rehabilitation, a rare example of America living up to its stated ideals. The truth, like most truth, lay somewhere between these extremes, complicated, contradictory, both imperfect and transformative. But for the women who lived it, for the cowboys who taught them, for the horses that carried them across Montana's high plains, the program meant something simpler and more immediate. It meant that yesterday's enemies could become today's partners. It meant that assumptions could be challenged and overcome. It meant that the American West, built on conquest and exclusion, could also become a place of inclusion and redemption. The leather gloves, worn and cracked and stained with years of honest work, carried this meaning in every crease and tear. They had protected hands that pulled rope and gripped reins. They had enabled work that built lives and futures. They had symbolized a transformation that occurred, not in halls of government, but in the dirt and sweat and daily struggle of people learning to see each other as human beings rather than categories. On frowned, cold autumn evenings, when the wind howled down from the mountains and snow threatened in the air, the old cowboys would sometimes gather and remember. They would remember the Japanese women who arrived terrified and left transformed. They would remember Sachiko's first clean rope throw, Keiko's steady hands on a frightened horse, the sound of women singing in 2 languages while riding home at sunset. And they would understand, perhaps for the first time, that the American promise was not about being better than others, but about becoming better than yourself. That freedom was not the absence of struggle, but the presence of choice. That redemption was always possible for those willing to risk it. The Montana plains stretched empty now, the ranches smaller, the cowboys fewer, the great herds diminished. But the story remained, written in old photographs and faded letters, in memories passed down through generations, in leather gloves preserved in museums and attics. It was a story about horses and women and men learning to see past their fears. It was a story about a nation struggling to live up to its stated values. It was a story about the transformative power of work done well, of trust earned slowly, of dignity restored one day at a time. Most of all, it was a story about how the most profound changes happen not through grand gestures, but through small acts of courage repeated daily until they become identity. The Japanese women did not conquer America or the West. They simply learned to ride horses. But, in that simple act, they claimed something that could never be taken away. The knowledge that they belonged to themselves, that their worth was self-determined, that they were free. And freedom, once tasted, once earned, once lived, even briefly, could never be entirely forgotten. It remained like the feel of leather in calloused hands, like the rhythm of a horse beneath you, like the endless Montana sky promising that tomorrow might be different than yesterday. That change was always possible, that redemption rode just beyond the horizon, waiting for those brave enough to seek it.